Superman, New Dawn, Metropolis, Florida, June 2018. It was a typical Tuesday morning for Clark Kent as he was coming into work into the busy newsroom. Well, Clark Kent takes his seat at his desk amid the hustle and bustle of the newsroom, turns on his computer, and starts his task for the day, covering the sports section while the regular sports writer was out on vacation. He hated sports. He liked to play it, but he did not like to watch it. Well, he saw Anita come in and sit across the desk from him. His heart let out a slight flutter. He was falling in love with her even though he didn't want to, but it seemed to be inevitable. Well, Anita took her place, but before she got busy, she turned around and said, "Oh, good morning, Clark. How's your day?" Clark says, it's still early, Anita. Why don't you ask me in about an hour? I have to go out to a baseball game in a few hours and cover that. I'm not looking forward to it." Anita lets out a slight giggle. She's like, "Oh, Clark, you hate sports that much, don't you?" she says. Clark says, "I don't like sports. I don't hate it. I just don't like sitting and watching it. I'd rather be out there playing it." Anita says, "I hear you, Clark. I hear you." Then Clark asks her, "So, what are you doing today, Anita?" Anita says, "Oh, I get to cover the christening and the maiden voyage of some brand new cruise ship. It's going out to sea, maybe a few miles out Port Metropolis, then make a U-turn and head back. Total maybe 2 or 3 hours. It's strictly the press that's going to be on there," she says, which I don't mind. Clark says to her, "Well, lucky you. I wish I was out there. It's better than covering a baseball game." Anita lets out another giggle and a smile. She's like, "Oh, Clark, face it, you're too good at your job. That's why you got the sports section." Clark's like, "Yeah, don't remind me." Well, later on that day, the new cruise ship, Star Ocean, was about to begin its maiden voyage. After the breaking the champagne bottle on the hull, the big horn sounded and the cruise ship started to take off. The maiden voyage was filled with everybody from the press from all over the state. Meanwhile, Clark was at the baseball game, watching it, hating it. He was there with the rest of the sports writers at Writers' Row in the stadium. Everyone like him had their pad and pencils, just writing down everything. Clark was trying his darndest to liven up the game. The game had very low attendance, and it was just a very bad game. The home team was losing. Clark was shouting, "Hey, batta, 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 swing, batta," and also shouting, "Hey, pitcher, pitcher, catcher, pitcher, pitcher, catcher," but nothing was killing the boredom that he was experiencing. Meanwhile, on the maiden voyage, Anita was enjoying everything. The tour of the luxurious cruise ship, and the fine foods that were being served. It was the best assignment she's had in a long time, and she was enjoying herself. Well, unbeknownst to her and the rest of the press that were on the ship, disaster was going to strike. Deep beneath the decks in the engine room, there was a bomb by the engine, and the bomb was about to go off. The blast echoed throughout the cruise ship. Everybody heard it and began panicking. Meanwhile, on the bridge, all the alarm bells were going off, as it was showing that their engines were dead. The captain turns around and sends one of his workers down there to see what's going on. Sure enough, the worker made it to the engine room and saw that the engines were destroyed and there was a big hole in the hull, and they were taken in water quickly. The worker radioed his findings back to the bridge. The captain gets on the PA and does his best to assure the people that they were safe. Well, in reality, they weren't. They were about to sink. He also radios the Coast Guard, and the Coast Guard said it would take them an hour or two to get out there to rescue them. And to add insult to injury, well, you have a cruise ship full of reporters. It didn't take them very long to figure out what was going on. The ship was sinking. And they all sent their text messages and phone calls out back to the mainland. And sure enough, All the news stations began reporting on the trouble with the Star Ocean as it was slowly sinking into the sea. Meanwhile, Clark Kent arrives back at the Daily Planet and he sees the entire newsroom in chaos. It was all too familiar what was going on. There was something big going on. So he runs over to Mr. White's office and knocks on the door. Mr. White screams, "Come in." Clark comes in and he says, "Mr. White, what's going on?" Well, Mr. White looks at Clark and is like, "What, you haven't heard nothing, Clark?" Clark says, "No, sir, I just got back from that baseball game." Mr. White says, "Well, Kent, when you were out covering the game, that new cruise ship, the Star Ocean, turned into the Poseidon Adventure. Now it's slowly sinking into the sea. Anita's on board and every other press person's on board, and the Coast Guard is still trying to get their act together before they go out and rescue them." Clark says, "Gee, that's terrible, Mr. White. What about the lifeboats?" Well, Mr. White says, "Can you believe it? There's no lifeboats on board. It was the maiden voyage. You didn't expect any problems to go on, so no one can get off." Clark's like, "Oh, gee, my, Mr. White, that is terrible." "Well, what do you want me to do, Mr. White?" asked Clark. Well, Perry White says, "Well, Clark, I just want you to find out about these people who own the Star Ocean and all that stuff, background, the usual 9 yards." Clark says to Perry White, "Yes, sir," and he leaves his office. Well, Clark knew it was time for Superman to act. So Clark takes the elevator downstairs and he goes out to the back alley behind the Daily Planet. It was nice, quiet, and there's usually nobody around. So he begins running, takes off his glasses, and changes into Superman and takes off flying in the air. Within moments, Superman breaks the sound barrier. By the time that Superman exited Metropolis to the ocean, he had already reached Mach 6. Well, on the Star Ocean, things were looking bleak as the water line was getting higher and higher, and all the reporters were panicking. Oh, they were sitting on the big story, but the question was, were they going to survive to write about it? Well, finally, Superman arrives. As he was heading high speed towards them, he sees the ship as it was getting lower and lower into the water. Finally, Superman does a huge nosedive. As the people on board the cruise ship were panicking, all of a sudden they saw the water line starting to get lower and lower and lower. The ship was raising up. Everybody knew on board what was causing it. It was Superman. People began cheering and jumping around and celebrating as Superman lifted the cruise ship out of the water a few feet in the air and began flying it back to Metropolis at around 40 miles an hour, a safe speed for the people on board. Well, finally, Superman puts the cruise ship on a beach and flies on top of the deck to see if everybody was okay. Everybody was okay and they thanked Superman. Superman says, "Well, I hope this does not put you off from going on cruises or boat rides." He says, "Goodbye, everybody," and he leaps into the air and flies off. Well, Anita was not impressed. She was thankful, but she was not impressed. She said in a low tone, "Show off," as Superman flew off. Well, the excitement of the day was over. Anita returned to the Daily Planet and quickly began writing the story out. Well, after she was done, Clark comes up to her and says, "Anita, are you okay?" Anita says, "Oh, yes, Clark, I am okay. I am thankful that Superman saved us," but she says to Clark, "I don't like that guy. I don't trust him," she says. Then Anita goes on, "I know, Clark, he's your close friend, and you're the only friend he has. But Clark, I just don't trust the fella. He can turn on us any time. In fact, it's happened before. How many times he's been exposed to elements that turned him evil?" Clark says to Anita, "Now, listen, Anita. Yes, it's happened before, but he's always been turned back." Then Clark goes on, "I trust the man 100%. He will never turn on us out of his own free will." Anita looks at Clark and is like, "Clark, I don't know how you can have confidence in him." Clark says, "Okay, that's enough. I'm not going to talk about this anymore. I know you don't like him. That's your personal opinion. I'm going to respect it." Anyways, Clark says, "You know what, Anita? Let me tell you something. When you were out there about to die, I was worried about you. I was really, really worried about you. I thought I was never going to see you again." Clark and Anita had that look in their eye like they were ready to kiss. Anita's like, Clark, when I was out there, all I could do was think about you, which is strange. I thought I would be thinking about my parents, about the rest of my family, but all I could do was think about you, Clark. Then after the crisis was averted, all I could do was think about running back here to see you again and tell you what happened. Clark says to Anita, "Well, I'm glad you made it back safely." And the two act like they were going to kiss before Jimmy Olsen interrupted him. He was screaming, "Anita, Mr. White wants to see you in his office right away." Anita says, "Okay, Jimmy, I'm on my way." Anita gets up from her seat and leaves to Mr. White's office. Then Jimmy asks Clark, "Hey Clark, have you heard anything from Lois?" Clark says, "No, I haven't heard anything from Lois, and let's just leave it that way. She's engaged to be married, she's got a new life. Let her move on, let me move on, let bygones be bygones." Jimmy, seeing how upset Clark was on the subject, said, "Okay, Mr. Kent, the subject is dropped. I won't say anything anymore about Miss Lane." Clark says to Jimmy, "Thank you." Afterwards, Tim Hadley comes running up. Tim Hadley was a reporter in the Daily Planet, and he says, "Hey guys, you won't believe what I just found out." Clark looks at him and says, "What is it, Tim?" Tim goes on, "I just received an anonymous phone call from a person that works for the company that built the Star Ocean. Apparently, my source says that the company, Stewart Engineering, that built the Star Ocean has filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, and its owner and CEO, Winston Stewart, is facing criminal charges for embezzlement." Clark says, "Wow, Tim, it all makes sense now. He probably planned the bomb on the ship so he can try to collect the insurance money." Then Clark grabs a telephone on his desk and calls Detective Henderson. An hour later, the police had the office building where Stewart Engineering was located at surrounded. Detective Henderson was leading the arrest. Apparently, Winston Stewart has barricaded himself in his office and has taken several employees hostage. Well, Clark comes up to Detective Henderson and asks him what's going on. Detective Henderson fills him in on what was going on, and he also says that Winston Stewart was asking for an airplane so he can flee to Jamaica. Then Clark asks Detective Henderson, "How many hostages are inside of there?" Henderson says, "There's 6, and they're on the 8th floor of the building." Then a police officer comes up to Detective Henderson and says something in a low tone to Detective Henderson. Detective Henderson shouts out, "Oh, just great." Clark's like, "What is it, Detective?" "Well, Kent, it seems like the SWAT team is stuck in traffic. There's a massive wreck out on the freeway, and they don't know when they're going to get it cleared. This is just great. This is just what I need," said the detective angrily. Clark knew at that moment that was his cue for Superman. Then Clark says to Detective Henderson, "Excuse me, Detective, I think I know someone who could take care of that." Detective Henderson knew who Clark was alluding to. So Clark slips away and goes through all the police and the crowd of onlookers, and he finds a quiet place to change at. It was an old phone booth that was still in operation. He made sure the coast was clear. He opens the phone booth, gets in, does a high-speed twirl, and becomes Superman. Well, inside the office building, Winston had his hostages at gunpoint. He was looking out the window and says, "As soon as I get my airplane ready, I'm going to let you all go, and then we could forget about this whole thing." One of the hostages says, "You'll never get away with this, Winston. You will not." Winston says to the hostage, "Oh, shut up." Well, as Winston was waiting for a response from the police, there was a loud crash that came from the right wall. A streak of red and blue came flying through at such high speed that Winston had no time to react, and suddenly he was knocked out cold. The hostages cheered Superman as he took out Winston. Superman asks everybody, "Is everyone okay?" Everybody said, "Yes, thank you, Superman." Superman says, "Don't worry, ladies and gentlemen, the police are on their way." as he lets out a big smile. Like and subscribe. The end.